Hi, I'm Kenneth Schultz. I'd like to tell you about my new book, Western Civilization Under Siege, and the subtitle is The Assault on the Western Mind. This is an important book, in my opinion, as it details all of the major threats facing the West, the Western culture, and even Western civilization. I'm not alone in these ideas and thoughts. Quite a few notable people have spoken out on it, including the famous historian and author Niall Ferguson, who said, "We are living through the end of 500 years of Western ascendancy." That's a pretty stark statement to make. And author Douglas Murray, whose recent book, The Strange Death of Europe, says Europe is committing suicide. My book is somewhat different than most other books on the subject in that it has put together all of what I consider to be the major threats facing the West and Western civilization. Let's have a look at some of the threats that are detailed in this book. Attacks against our culture started around 80 years ago. A face at the top of the cover of the book is that of Antonio Gramsci, an Italian communist who decided in the late 1920s that the workers of the West were not going to rise up and overthrow their governments and install a communist government as they did in Russia. He came to the conclusion that the West had been subverted by Christianity, and therefore the West had to be de-Christianised by what he called a long march through the culture, starting with the traditional family and engulfing churches, media, governments, entertainment, literature, all aimed at breaking down the fabric of our society to make it possible to install his idea of a Marxist utopia. At the same time, a group of academics in Germany set up what was called the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, and later became known as the Frankfurt School. These were all academics, and they had their own version of Marxism, and it was a combination of Gramsci, Marxism and Freud. And again, they wanted to destroy capitalism and replace it with their view of Marxism. With the rise of Hitler, these academics had to flee Germany, as most of them were Jews. They arrived in the United States, and being academics, they quickly found places in some of the leading universities in America, where they were able to spread their pernicious philosophy. And in time, the universities began turning out graduates who were really cultural Marxists. The work of the Frankfurt School would be carried on by some of the other faces on the cover of the book, including George Soros, Saul Alinsky, and the Ford Foundation, represented on the cover by its president. At the heart of the attacks on Western civilization are Marxist academics, left-wing journalists and authors rewriting history to bring out all the bad points of Western civilization, such as colonialism, treatment of indigenous populations, slavery, and completely overlooking all the great advances brought about by Western civilization. So today, as a result of all this, many graduates and many young people have a negative view of Western civilization, and many see socialism as a better alternative. Just that such is the level of the indoctrination that they've received. Gramsci, the Frankfurt School and those that followed have been, unfortunately, very successful. Until today, most of our universities have been subverted. Freedom of speech is on the decline, and we are now controlled largely by political correctness. We now have to be careful of what we say and what we write in case we're hauled before some human rights commissar and threatened with a fine or even a jail sentence. The march of Islam across the West. Now, Islam is approaching us on three fronts to carry out the jihad as set down by Muhammad. And it's all based on what Muhammad originally said, in that there will be no peace in the world until the whole world is Islam. And therefore he asks every Muslim to carry forward this jihad in whatever way they can, through terrorism or just slowly spreading the word or whatever, to try and bring about this world peace, so-called, by making the whole world Muslim. Now, the Muslims are attacking us on three fronts. The first is terrorism. That's pretty obvious. Everybody knows about terrorism, except of course our world leaders, who stupidly say terrorism has got nothing to do with Islam. Nothing could be further from the truth. Even George Bush has said Islam is peace, and Islam has got nothing to do with terrorism. Absolute stupidity. They only have to look at the Quran and the sayings of Muhammad and the caliphs that followed him and the history of Islam. Islam has been carrying out its jihad against non-Muslim countries for 1400 years. Now, the purpose of terrorism is mainly to bring about fear in the minds of the authorities, the politicians, the police, and to that end they're succeeding very well. An example of this was when Canadian filmmaker and author Lauren Southern visited Australia recently. She just wanted to take some video outside the Lakemba Mosque in Sydney. But before she got to the mosque, her way was barred on the street by a number of police, led by a police inspector. And that inspector said, "You are not to proceed further. I don't want you going near the mosque. You may be causing a breach of the peace." That from a senior inspector. If that's not appeasement and fear of Islam, I don't know what is. One of the worst examples of fear and appeasement occurred in Britain, where Muslim rape gangs over a period of decades raped, beat, trafficked and sexually exploited young British white girls under the noses of the authorities, the police, local authorities and the media, all because they were afraid of being called racist or not wanting to rock the multicultural boat. It was a disgusting and shameful episode in British history. The second prong of the attack of the Islamists on the West is through infiltration. Groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood work on this. They set out to infiltrate all levels of society, from the police, the political system, and through the media, to gradually spread the word of Islam. And the third prong of the attack is what is called al-Hijra. And Hijra means to immigrate. The requirement of all Muslims to try and immigrate to non-Muslim areas, to slowly infiltrate, to slowly set up power authorities, and ultimately to bring about Islamic State governed by Sharia law. Another threat is posed by China's expansion. China's Xi Jinping, a dictator for life, and previous leaders have said they want China to become the dominant power in the world. And they're working very hard to achieve this. They're doing it through spying, through infiltration, through stealing intellectual property, by using trade to build up their economy at the expense of workers in other countries, until they are now a very powerful force in the world, and they have at the same time built up their army, their air force, their navy, and they pose a serious threat to the West. Then we have a threat to our economies and our industrial bases brought about by the extremist environmental movement, particularly the Greens. The Green gurus and leaders have actually said They want to shut down industry to so-called protect the environment. And one of the ways of doing this is through the global warming scare, or as they have renamed it, climate change, because global warming seems to have ceased for the time being. They are working very strongly in this area and are having a big influence. At the moment in Australia in particular, their aim is to shut down the coal industry, stop exporting coal, shut down coal mines, to close down ultimately all coal mines and ultimately all coal-fired power stations. Another threat is the very real possibility of a global financial collapse. The world is awash with debt. The global debt level is, at last count, over $224 trillion. A huge amount. Throughout the world, the governments are just racking up more debt and not doing a lot about it, leaving the repayment to future generations. This can't go on indefinitely. Sooner or later, there's going to be a financial collapse. It may start with the United States, and if it does and the United States economy collapses, it will drag down most other economies with it. Then we have a threat to our democracy and our freedom of speech by globalists. These are people who want to do away with borders, do away with national sovereignty, and bring about a world government ruled by the United Nations and in turn ruled by an unelected elite. We have a great example of this in Europe. The European Union are now bringing out laws that stifle freedom of speech through so-called hate speech laws and are gradually eroding freedom of speech throughout the European Union. The threats covered in this video will be covered in greater detail in subsequent videos. My book is available from Amazon.com. I'll finish with a quote from Donald Trump. The fundamental question of our time is whether the West has the will to survive.